hard for me to see solutions to.
So you don't want to
where
be
we're
married
going.
anymore?
I don't know.
For real, you're gonna say that to me? I thought this would be a fun adventure, but I'm out.
He looked her in the eye and said it, calmly, without rage, without tears, without noise. I don't know if I want to be married anymore. That single sentence wasn't shouted in a fight or thrown like a weapon. It dropped quietly in the middle of silence. No yelling, no slamming doors, no dramatic walkout. Just that one flat, exhausted truth. And for the first time in their entire history of conflict, Mano had no script left to follow. Because this wasn't Anthony threatening. This was Anthony detaching. And that is a completely different kind of danger. Welcome to TLC Drama Live. I'm Sabrina, and if you haven't already, subscribe right now and let me know in the comments, was this the moment it truly ended? See, if you followed Anthony and Mano, you already know the rhythm. Fight, threat, retreat, apology. Her anger, his guilt. She storms out, he runs after her. He sits with his head down, she lectures him. They circle the drain and call it love. But this moment didn't follow that loop. This moment broke it. This moment wasn't loud, it was quiet. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because when someone finally stops reacting, it means they're not fighting to fix it anymore. They're letting it die on its own. You could see it in Anthony's body language before the words even came out. The distance in his eyes, the stillness in his hands, the fact that he wasn't pleading anymore. He was reflecting. He wasn't defending. He was done. And if you watched Mano in that second, you could see it hit her like a slap she never expected. She blinked. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because all this time, she'd been testing the edge, threatening the fall, believing she'd never actually lose him. And then, suddenly, he wasn't holding the ledge anymore. That's the cost of rehearsing the same threat too many times. Divorce became her line, her punctuation mark, her exit door. But when you cry wolf long enough, the person on the other side stops running. And that's exactly what Anthony did. He stopped chasing. What makes this different isn't that they had a fight. It's that he didn't flinch after. It's that he didn't text. He didn't knock on the dressing room door. He didn't fold. This time, he stayed in his seat and let her feel the silence. And that shift, that tiny behavioral reset, is more powerful than any screaming match. Because now, Mano isn't facing the version of Anthony who reacts. She's facing the version who might walk. And you can't manipulate silence. You can't yell it into submission. You can't emotionally corner someone who's already turned their back. The balance flipped, and she felt it. You could see it in the way her face hardened, not from power, but from panic. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure she could pull him back. And that's where the tension lives now. Not in what they say, but in what they stop doing. Anthony's no longer performing the role of the husband who absorbs. He's pausing, observing, testing if her reaction is real or rehearsed. And Mano? She's realizing that her old patterns aren't landing, that she's used up all the shock value, and now she's standing on a stage where no one's following her off it. He didn't run after her. And for her, that silence is louder than anything he's ever said. She did it again. Walked off set, heels clacking, shoulders squared, not even turning back. Another storm out mid-argument, as if her absence alone would force presence from him. And for a long time, it worked. In every earlier season, every backstage camera flash, the pattern played out like clockwork. Mano storms off, Anthony follows. He chases her down the hallway, voice low, trying to patch over the latest eruption with softness. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes fear. Sometimes he just doesn't want the cameras to catch her sobbing alone. But the outcome's the same. She pulls away, he pulls closer. Not this time. This time, he stayed seated. No glance to the side, no shift in his body, no tug on the mic. Just stillness. Almost like he'd rehearsed letting her leave and choosing not to follow. Because at some point, even the person who always fixes it stops believing it's fixable. And if you look back at their earlier episodes, you'll see it, the micro patterns. Her walkouts were never about needing space. They were a way to test loyalty, to bait regret. Walking away, for Mano, was never about distance. It was about being pulled back. And until now, Anthony made that mistake every time. He followed. He apologized for things he didn't even say. He tried to fix the mood before understanding what even broke it. But when silence follows a storm out, the game flips. Because walking out only works if someone opens the door behind you. And now, no one did. Mano didn't get pursuit. She got air, and cameras, and her own echo. And that's when walking away starts to feel less like power and more like panic. Think about it. If leaving is your go-to tactic in conflict, what happens when the person stops coming after you? What if they stop fearing your exit? That's what she's facing now. Her entire posture when she left assumed she'd be followed. But his posture never moved. And what changed? That's the loop. That's the thing that's going to define this tell-all. Not what she did, but why he didn't. Because this isn't about one fight. This is about emotional trend lines. Maybe it's one too many threats. Maybe it's fatigue. Maybe it's grief for the version of their marriage that only exists in memory. But something in Anthony clicked off. Not permanently, but enough to resist the old pull. Enough to realize that always being the one to repair doesn't make you strong, it just makes you predictable. And predictable people get emotionally drained. Fast. The cameras didn't cut. She vanished backstage. He stayed. And somewhere in that gap between conflict and follow-up, a dressing room door closed behind her. And the next thing she hears isn't Anthony's voice. It's her own silence bouncing off cold walls. And the question rising in her chest isn't, why is he angry? It's, why didn't he come after me? She was already seated when the door finally opened. Arms crossed, brows tense, a mixture of anger and something quieter, something closer to panic, flickering behind her eyes. She expected a chase. She expected the door to open 5 minutes ago. She expected Anthony to come in with that same old, guilt-heavy energy, ready to explain himself, ready to apologize for not saying what she needed to hear on camera. But when he finally walked in, the energy was off. No fear, no softness, no hurry. He moved like a man who wasn't there to fix anything, just to say what was true. She clocked it instantly. And that's why the first words out of her mouth came sharper than they needed to. Why didn't you come after me? She tried to make it sound annoyed. Like his silence had been the disrespect. But her voice cracked halfway through. Like her heart hadn't signed off on the delivery. Anthony didn't raise his tone. He didn't match her heat. He sat down slowly, didn't even face her fully, just looked out ahead and said it plain. Like he'd been practicing in his head for hours. I don't know if I want to be married anymore. She blinked. That silence between them stretched so long, the walls felt closer. She hadn't expected to be the one asking. She thought she was delivering a test. But suddenly she was taking one, and she had no idea what the right answer was. His tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't performative. He didn't weaponize his pain. But he was exhausted, and you could hear that in the way he barely moved his mouth when he spoke. The pauses weren't for drama. They were because his mind was scraping for energy. He wasn't punishing her. He was protecting what little of himself was left. And that's what made it land so hard. This wasn't about one fight. It was a slow erosion. Threat after threat, argument after argument, each one taking just a little more oxygen out of the room. Each time Mano stormed off, expecting him to chase, another part of him got tired of the chase. And now, in this quiet, dimly lit dressing room, you could feel the weight of all those unspoken wounds gathering in his chest. Not lashing out, just sitting there, heavy. Her face didn't fold right away. Mano tried to hold her anger like armor, but the cracks kept forming. Her nostrils flared, her lips parted like she was going to argue. But she didn't have a counter for that sentence. Because when someone says they're unsure about staying, it means they've already been mentally leaving. And she knew that. This wasn't just a fight. This was the moment where the balance of power shifted without warning. And she was left wondering whether her own patterns had finally pushed him past the point of caring. He didn't explain it further. He didn't drag up old receipts or bring out a list of wrongs. That's what made it feel different. If he'd come in swinging, she could have fought back. If he'd come in crying, she could have comforted. But he came in quiet, and now she had nothing to grip, no angle to defend, no opening to control. And it scared her. Because for the first time in this whole roller coaster relationship, Mano was no longer the one choosing when the distance stopped. He didn't stop it. He didn't try to shorten it. He didn't wrap it up in soft words or a forced compromise. He just sat there, looking exhausted, like he couldn't tell if trying again would be brave or just more slow bleeding. She tried to regain ground, asked if he was serious, asked if he'd just said that to hurt her. But he didn't flinch. He didn't chase the comfort of her doubt. That's when her face finally cracked. You could see it in her mouth first, that small tremble she tried to hide by tightening her jaw, the way her eyes started blinking a little too often. And when she looked down, when she couldn't hold his gaze anymore, it wasn't anger anymore, it was fear. Real fear. Anthony stayed quiet. He didn't press. He didn't fill the silence. And that was the most honest thing he could have done. Because sometimes silence isn't a punishment. It's an answer. And in that silence, Mano didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't walk out again. She just sat there, eyes heavy, lips pressed, hands clenched tight on her knees, like holding still was the only thing keeping her from breaking. She wasn't used to this version of him. Not the man who shuts down, not the one who listens without blinking, not the one who doesn't jump in with damage control the second she raises her voice. For years, she'd been dancing on the edge of emotional explosions, always confident that no matter how loud she got or how far she pushed, Anthony would meet her there, full of reaction, full of apologies, ready to rebuild the mess they made in the heat. But now he was still, measured, not cold, but distant. And that stillness unnerved her more than any yelling match ever could. For the first time, it wasn't her walking out, it was him pulling back without leaving the room. That's what silence does when you're used to noise. It feels like abandonment, even when the person hasn't moved. And for someone like Mano, whose way of communicating had always been intensity, volume, gestures, dramatic exits, that silence felt like punishment. But it wasn't. It was Anthony finally taking up space for his own feelings without needing to justify them. That's what made it so destabilizing. Because when someone who's always carried your emotions quietly decides to carry their own instead, the emotional script falls apart. And yet, it's too easy to turn this into a simple narrative of strength and weakness. Mano's style didn't come from nowhere. When you grow up in spaces where emotional expression is linked to survival, where if you don't raise your voice, you don't get heard, it's hard to believe that stillness is safety. It can feel like rejection. And that fear of being ignored becomes a force of its own. It pushes you to speak louder, to test boundaries, to force reaction. Because reaction means presence, and presence feels like love, especially in relationships that constantly teeter on the edge of emotional disconnect. But Anthony's silence wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting himself. And maybe for the first time, that was the priority. His stillness didn't mean he stopped caring. It meant he stopped breaking himself apart to keep her steady. That kind of shift can be hard to witness if you've never seen someone put themselves first in a dynamic that's always revolved around repair. And for Mano, who was used to steering the mood, reading his silence as distance instead of clarity was inevitable. That confusion showed in the way her voice softened mid-sentence, then hardened again. She didn't know whether to be angry, hurt, or afraid, because she no longer knew which version of Anthony she was talking to. She asked again, quieter this time, if he meant what he said earlier, if he truly didn't know whether he wanted to be married anymore. He didn't rush to answer. He looked at the floor for a second, then up, then somewhere past her, like he was talking more to himself than to her. I don't know if fixing it means anything anymore, or if we're just doing damage control, but because we don't know how to leave. That sentence didn't land like a weapon. It landed like a mirror. And she didn't like the reflection. Because now, the question hanging in the air wasn't just about staying together. It was about whether either of them even remembered what healthy looked like, or if they were clinging to a structure that no longer held anything worth saving. She didn't answer. She stared at him like she was trying to find the version of him she used to know under all the quiet. But it wasn't there, not in the way she remembered. And maybe that was the shift. Maybe this wasn't Anthony pulling away. Maybe this was Anthony changing, growing. Or maybe it was emotional withdrawal disguised as clarity. That's the loop now. Was this strength? Or was it surrender? They sat in that silence a little longer, neither sure what to say next. Then, almost out of rhythm with the moment, he spoke, I think we need to talk. Like, really talk. Not fix. Just talk. She nodded once, almost like she didn't trust her own voice yet. And they sat there, in that fragile in-between space, after the chaos, before the next decision. Two people who had been loud for years, finally letting the quiet speak. When they left the stage, it wasn't with fireworks, no slammed doors, no yelling match, No final insult hurled across the studio. It was quiet, measured. They didn't even hold hands. Anthony walked a few steps ahead. Mano followed without speaking. But what the cameras caught, what stuck in everyone's mind, was the image left behind. Her shoes. Still sitting on stage, perfectly placed. Forgotten. Or maybe not forgotten at all. She'd kicked them off earlier in the chaos, like she always did when things got heated, when she needed to move, to pace, to stomp her frustration into the floor. But this time, she didn't come back for them. She left barefoot, raw, exposed in a way that made the whole studio still. It wasn't the shoes themselves that mattered, it was what they represented. For someone like Mano, always poised, always sharp, always fully styled, leaving without them felt like letting go of control, even if just for a moment. And the stage, once filled with the noise of their tension, felt different in their absence. Because public conflict has a rhythm. It plays to an audience, it feeds on energy, reactions, the swell of commentary from others sitting nearby. That stage had seen their drama unfold before, seen the loud exits, the stunned gasps, the tense stare-downs. But this time, what lingered wasn't the noise. It was the aftermath. Her shoes resting in the middle of it, like a marker of all the fights that weren't finished, of all the pain that hadn't yet found words. Anthony didn't look back. Mano didn't rush to grab them. And in that still image, something shifted. Because the drama didn't climax on stage, it retreated behind a closed door where cameras couldn't follow and viewers couldn't judge. And that's where things get messier. Because when conflict isn't being performed, it's harder to control. There's no audience to win. No one to validate your version. Just the person across from you. And all the things you've left unsaid for too long. Sometimes what's left behind tells you more than what was said out loud. Maybe she didn't mean to leave the shoes. Maybe she simply forgot. But the result is the same. A visible absence in the middle of a scene they dominated for weeks. And the question now isn't whether they left the stage, it's whether they'll ever return to it as a couple. The off-camera space holds answers no one else will get to see. But off-camera doesn't always mean off-conflict. It just means the script changes. They said they needed to talk. And maybe they did. Maybe in that dressing room, or in the car ride home, or over a long silence at the kitchen table, something shifted again. Maybe it was honest. Maybe it was uncomfortable. Or maybe it was a new performance, just quieter. Something meant to keep the pieces intact a little longer. But whatever happened after they stepped out of view, one thing is clear. They didn't resolve anything in front of us. That silence isn't closure. It's a comma. And whether the next sentence begins with repair or rupture, only time will tell. But for now, the shoes stay. And the stage remembers. I've heard divorce so many times. He said it without raising his voice, without pointing fingers, just laying it out like a fact he'd memorized by repetition. And that's exactly what it had become, repetition. Divorce wasn't a word that dropped like a bomb anymore. It had become background noise, a default setting in every fight. And when words meant to end something are thrown around often enough, they stop creating urgency. They start creating numbness, not because the listener doesn't care, but because the threat starts to feel like theater. That's what happened to Anthony. Every time Mano shouted, "Divorce?" she thought she was drawing a line. But what she was really doing was wearing down the ground beneath them. At first, he panicked. Then he tried harder. Then he shut down. Because the body can only absorb so much tension before it stops responding. That's not cruelty on her part. And it's not cowardice on his. It's behavioral conditioning. You train someone, unintentionally, to stop reacting when the same threat never leads to action. And eventually they do. Mano wasn't malicious. That's the piece that gets lost in all the judgment. People who throw extreme words in arguments aren't always trying to end things. They're trying to be heard. When someone feels like their normal tone doesn't land, they raise the volume. When they feel like their fear is being dismissed, they mask it with force. Divorce, for Mano, may never have meant finality. It might have just meant, please listen to me. But when the message keeps escalating and the other person keeps absorbing, something has to give. And for Anthony, it gave in the quietest way possible. He stopped chasing, stopped fixing, stopped responding to the alarm. Because when someone tells you again and again they're going to leave, eventually you start preparing for their absence. even if they don't mean it, even if you want them to stay. Self-protection kicks in. You brace for the exit. And sometimes that means emotionally checking out long before the door opens. That's not a sign of strength, it's survival. Threats lose power when they become routine. And once that happens, even reconciliation starts to feel like a performance instead of a promise. Still, it's not black and white. Mano's pain is real too. The intensity, the sharpness in her language, the pattern of pushing, it didn't come from nowhere. Maybe she learned that staying loud was the only way to avoid being forgotten. Maybe she spent so long fighting to be visible that she never realized how invisible it made her partner feel. There's a sadness in that. Two people screaming to be seen and neither of them actually hearing the other. So now the stage is empty. The threats have stopped, but not because things are healed, because Anthony doesn't flinch anymore. That's what's dangerous. Not yelling, not the storm outs, the silence after, the shift from fighting to floating. That place where people stop arguing not because they've reached peace, but because they've stopped believing it's worth the energy. And you have to ask, what's Anthony still holding on to? Is he here because he believes there's something left to save? Or is he staying because they share a child? And he doesn't know how to walk away without feeling like the bad guy. Is this love or guilt with a timeline? He said they needed to talk, and maybe that's true. But what version of himself will show up for that conversation? The man who used to patch holes before they spread? Or the man who's quietly packing up his energy one unspoken sentence at a time? The answer hasn't come yet, and maybe even he doesn't know. She froze. For once, the comeback didn't come. No sarcasm, no raised brow, no scripted clapback, just silence. A stillness so unnatural for Mano, it felt like someone hit pause on her personality. Because when Anthony said he didn't know if he wanted to be married anymore, it wasn't a bluff. It wasn't strategic. It didn't even sound angry. It sounded true. And that truth hit her like cold water. You could almost see her trying to rewind it in her head. Like maybe she misheard. Maybe there was a context she missed. Maybe it wasn't real. But it was. And in that instant, everything flipped. The control, the rhythm, the upper hand, gone. The room around them didn't move. But inside her, the floor shifted. Now imagine being in her shoes. If someone you thought would always try suddenly stopped trying. If the person who always folded, who always came back, who always softened the blow, sat across from you with no anger, no drama, and still said, I don't know if this is working. You'd panic, wouldn't you? You'd search their face for a sign, for an opening, for anything that looks like the version of them you used to know. But when they're calm, and you're not, it makes your chaos feel loud, embarrassing, unwelcome. That's what Mano was sitting in. The discomfort of realizing her usual moves had expired. And maybe you've been there too, on either side of it. Maybe you've yelled because you felt ignored, or shut down because you felt overpowered. Maybe you thought threatening to leave would wake them up, but instead, it taught them how to live without you. That's what emotional wear and tear does. It doesn't explode, it leaks, quietly, until the space that used to feel full now echoes. This is where everything breaks, and nothing looks broken on the outside. She sat there blinking, not crying, not yelling, but stuck in a moment she never saw coming, because she thought she controlled the exits. But now she didn't even know if the door was open anymore. And still, she couldn't ask him directly, not yet. She just looked at him like he was someone else, like a man she once knew, now wearing a new face. And that's when he said it. After the silence stretched too long, after the tension made the air too thick, he looked up and said, but I still want to try. He said it with tired eyes. Not hopeful, not dramatic, just tired. Like someone who knows trying doesn't guarantee anything, but not trying feels worse. And that changed everything again. Because now the question wasn't, is he leaving? It became, how do you rebuild with someone who's already imagined life without you? He said he didn't know if he wanted to be married anymore. Then, not long after, said he still wanted to try. That's not flip-flopping. That's what emotional contradiction looks like when someone's living in two truths at once. You can love someone and still feel done. You can want peace and still fear loneliness. You can imagine leaving and still want to stay. For the kids, for the memories, for the version of them you once believed in. Anthony isn't confused. He's conflicted. And there's a difference. It's the kind of contradiction that doesn't always make sense from the outside. But if you've ever been in a long relationship that's been dragged through arguments, emotional exhaustion, and patches of silence, you get it. You get how someone can sit across from their partner and not recognize them anymore, but still hope they show back up. You get how someone can speak the language of detachment, but still quietly hold the map of how things used to feel. Right now, Anthony's not operating from clarity. He's operating from survival. He's tired of being pushed to the edge, but still afraid of what happens if he lets go. He's been trained to expect a storm every time there's conflict. He's burned out from being the emotional cushion. And now he's wrestling with a question that's heavier than it sounds. What happens if I stop trying to hold this together? Mano's in her own contradiction too. Her patterns, storming off, threatening divorce, pushing him to react, were designed to keep closeness in the only language she knew. But now that those patterns have backfired, she's scared. Scared that the behavior she used to keep him might be the reason she loses him. And when both people are stuck between fear of leaving and fear of staying, every conversation becomes a standoff. This is the tension so many couples fall into. The push-pull of needing safety but not knowing how to ask for it without weaponizing it. Threats become a crutch. Walking away becomes the way to get pulled back in. And before you realize it, you're not resolving anything, you're just rehearsing survival. That's why so many relationships break quietly. Not from one explosion, but from this slow erosion of emotional trust. Here's what matters for everyone watching. If you're arguing to win or to escape, you've already left the connection. Conflict isn't a problem, but turning every disagreement into a test of whether the relationship survives, that's where the damage lives. You don't have to agree in every argument, but you do have to agree that the argument isn't the end of the story. And if you keep threatening to end it, eventually someone starts believing you mean it. You can't create safety while rehearsing abandonment. So now we're left with this fragile shift. Anthony is speaking less, observing more. Mano is talking softer, stepping slower. The chaos has quieted for now. But the silence isn't peace. It's a reset. The kind that can turn into something honest or fall apart all over again. And that's where we leave it in this moment. Not with resolution, but with a question. Is this change something they can sustain? Or is it just another pause before the pattern returns? Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't breaking up. It's staying in something that already broke and not knowing if there's still anything left to rebuild. From the moment Anthony sat there in silence, letting Mano walk off without a single glance, the entire rhythm of their relationship shifted. What began as one more storm off, another scene in their long series of emotionally explosive arguments, turned into something else entirely. It was the first time the script changed. The first time he didn't rise to the bait, and when he later said, with a steady voice and no theatrics, that he didn't know if he wanted to be married anymore, it wasn't meant to shock. It was a truth he had clearly carried for a long time, just finally spoken out loud. The loops were all there. The storm-offs, the cold dressing room, the shoes left behind, his quiet decision to stay seated and eat instead of plead. Every move broke a previous pattern. And what you're left with isn't a couple screaming their way to resolution. It's two people standing in the ruins of their habits, trying to figure out if there's anything real still underneath. That's the part no one tells you about long-term conflict. Sometimes it doesn't end with a big break. Sometimes it ends with detachment. Not because someone stopped caring, but because they got tired of being the only one trying to make things safe. And that's what Anthony's stillness really was. Not a power play, not emotional manipulation, but exhaustion disguised as control. He didn't stop chasing to win. He stopped because running in circles doesn't take you anywhere. And when Mano saw that, when she realized her usual triggers weren't triggering him anymore, it forced her to confront a version of Anthony she wasn't prepared for. One who didn't panic, one who didn't fix, one who no longer feared the silence. That's where the shift truly landed. Some relationships don't collapse with screams. They collapse in the quiet when one person no longer fears the other walking away. The truth is, Anthony may still love her. He may still want to try, but it won't be the same kind of trying. It won't be the chasing, the constant emotional patchwork, the endless peacekeeping. This time, if they rebuild, it'll have to be mutual. Not performance, not survival, Real effort from both sides, or not at all. Mano's silence in the dressing room wasn't just shock, it was recognition. A delayed realization that maybe she hadn't been holding the reins all along. Maybe she'd been pushing someone away who'd finally stopped trying to come back. And now, the control she thought she had feels hollow. What changed is the balance. What hasn't changed is the uncertainty. And that might be the most honest place they've ever been. Because now, neither one is pretending everything's fine. Neither one is forcing a fix. They're both sitting in the discomfort of what they created. And that discomfort, as raw and painful as it is, might be the first real foundation they've had in a long time. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't even a moment of clarity that left everyone with answers. It was what happens when exhaustion overtakes reaction. Divorce threats didn't stop working because they were forgiven or forgotten. They stopped working because Anthony ran out of emotional fuel. And when that happens, when someone stops reacting, stops chasing, stops even flinching, you don't get resolution. You get distance that looks like peace but feels like quiet grief. The final takeaway isn't that he found strength. It's that he found a limit. The kind of limit that doesn't explode, it folds in on itself. Slowly. Quietly. Anthony didn't walk away from Mano, but he walked away from being the emotional sponge in a dynamic that ran on volatility. That was the shift. And once someone stops absorbing everything, the entire cycle breaks. Mano didn't get closure, neither did he. They're still in it, technically. Still married, still figuring things out. But the core engine that powered their conflict for so long, her intensity, his reaction, is out of sync now. And that's what makes the future uncertain. Because when reaction dies, the relationship either grows up fast or falls apart quietly. There's no clean ending here. No dramatic kiss and makeup. No official breakup either. Just the echo of a couple realizing that what used to keep them connected might have been keeping them trapped. And when that realization hits, nothing feels stable. This isn't a breakup story, it's a fatigue story. And those are the ones that hurt the longest. Because when you leave a relationship emotionally before you leave physically, you carry that numbness into everything that follows. And for both of them, the question now isn't just, can we fix this? It's, do we even want the same version of love anymore? That's what makes this tell-all moment so unsettling. They're not screaming. They're not running. They're sitting in a silence that's louder than anything they said all season. And if this story left you shaken, wait until you hear what's coming next. Because while Anthony and Mano were stuck in an emotional loop, Luke and Malene were performing a marriage that wasn't even legal. In the next episode, we're breaking down the full legal contradiction behind their relationship timeline, the visa that doesn't match the marriage, and how public commitment becomes a weapon when control and confusion replace clarity. You think this tell-all was messy? You haven't seen what happens when rings disappear, paperwork stalls, and intentions get buried under diamond dust.